I'm Brad Samuels. I'm one of the 4 founding partners of SITU. We're a practice that has 3 divisions: SITU Fabrication, SITU Studio, and SITU Research. My role at SITU is both a business development and director of SITU Research. When we started 10 years ago, we were pretty scrappy, straight out of school, and it was kind of an everybody do everything kind of mentality. Now we're about 43 people and have grown and sort of adjusted accordingly. And we all come together for sort of intensive design, charrettes, and thinking, but all of us have sort of different roles in the day-to-day operations of the practice. So SITU Research, well, research was always part of it, right? Research being projects that we felt like we wanted to do or had to do or needed to be done for whatever reason that didn't yet have clients, let's say. So there was always speculative work being done, research being done, and at a certain point, it made sense to kind of formalize that practice for a couple of reasons. One being that we started to get funding from grants and sort of people that make research possible. And the other is that, while internally there are flows between fabrication, studio, and research, externally it's important for us to be able to identify as fabrication sometimes, as studio sometimes, and research other times. So SITU as a whole is the kind of umbrella which captures all of it, and for certain projects we're leveraging all 3, and for certain projects we're just one of those divisions at a time. I was about 7 years in, I would say, and fabrication was first to kind of become clearly separate from SITU Studio, and that was for interesting reasons having to do with the kind of business model of providing services basically to other architects and artists, and to make sure that there was no confusion about things that we ourselves have designed and things that we're building for other designers. SITU Research emerged kind of shortly thereafter, after getting kind of, like I said, some of the first few grants from the National Science Foundation and the European Research Council, and doing work which was really, I'd say, at the kind of perimeter of architecture. It's interesting in some contexts to talk about it that way, and I think in other contexts it actually can be confusing when you're kind of stretching as far as we are sometimes with relationship between all the other disciplines we work with and, let's say, the practice of building. I don't think anything in particular comes to mind, but we do work for human rights organizations. We do work with geologists. We are also thought about as a studio which has expertise in fabrication and construction. So if I'm talking to a construction manager about MEP on a project, they're probably not going to want to hear about geology, or they might. They might have been geology majors undergrad, and then those kinds of conversations can be incredibly interesting and actually very fruitful. So it's that ability to kind of be very specific at certain moments and sort of broader at others. So it's interesting. It's been very much a kind of it's emerged out of conversations, I think. In the beginning, as part of the work we did with the Forensic Architecture Project, it was really speculative. In other words, we think architects and filmmakers and artists can contribute to fact-finding, reporting, and human rights through use of tools, spatial practice, analysis. But this was just an idea. This was speculation. And so we had to really get in touch with different lawyers, different advocacy groups to ask them, can we help you with work you're doing? And the answer was very clear, yes, they have a lot of work that they need help with. And they don't always have resources in-house to kind of do sophisticated things to do with media and space and mapping, you know, a whole host of things. So those are the kind of early conversations, and I think those consisted of us going to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and other places and presenting work, and them saying, let me think about what I'm working on right now that you can help with. And through those initial dialogues, I think we became more aware of each other, and those conversations continued, and now there's just a kind of barrage of requests to work on a whole host of different projects related to human rights. And so it's evolved pretty radically over the last 3 years. Yeah, so we were part of that original grant, which is on your wall. We were funded through the European Research Council. We were, I don't know what our official, I think we were industrial partners, something like this. Anyways, in the language of grants. You know, we were on the team, the forensic architecture team, during the ERC grant, and we worked very closely with Eyal and Paulo and Charles and Lorenzo and all of the kind of PhD students at Goldsmiths who were driving that project. I think we did 5 case studies with them, each different than the last. And so that wrapped up in 2013, and since then we've gotten a grant from MacArthur Foundation and Oak Foundation to continue doing this work on our own, and now we're in the midst of more case work. I don't know. I mean, I can just speak for what we do and what we're interested in. I think the way we've thought about this work is that it's methodologically driven as opposed to thematic or geographic, right? So each case we work on, and this is something we developed when we were talking with our funders, we choose because it offers opportunities to innovate and do different things with new tools. So, you know, one project we're working on now has to do with a case where there's a lot of video content. There's hundreds of videos that document about a 6-hour period where a lot of people were killed. And that problem set is very specific. How do you manage that much content? How do you create a workflow that allows you to reconstruct space and time in a very specific and clear way? Another project we're doing is about creating a tool for the international criminal courts that will help them present destroyed sites of cultural heritage in a way that's understandable to the judges and the prosecution and the defense. So in that sense, it's a very different problem set, and we seek out different problem sets. So that's our interest, and there seems to be no lack of problems to address. No, at this point we're getting a lot of calls, emails, queries. Yeah, which is interesting and challenging too, because the research division is a part of a larger practice, and we have, we're a staff of 3 at the moment, so. We have to say no, of course, yeah, the art of saying no has become something that's important to figure out how to do. But we want, I mean, it's not because there's not a lot of interesting and important work to do, and I think it's also, what's more important here is, and I think the kind of funding world is also super interested in this. How do you keep this from becoming a very esoteric and, you know, what's the right word? You want to make, the question is, can you make these tools available to a much larger constituency, whether that's people working within human rights organizations, or it's funders who are you know, working in different countries and have activists on the ground there. I mean, does it need to be done in Brooklyn, New York, or in London? hopefully, I think the answer is no, but we're actively looking for ways to kind of transfer knowledge and make this a more distributed process, because like I said, there's plenty of work to be done. I mean, it works the other way around frequently too, which is that part of the team in research is a kind of coding, developing job, and that's unique within the studio as a whole. So the kind of ability for that person who's very comfortable in the kind of back end of digital platforms can become useful in fabrication problem sets sometimes. I mean, I think it's, Grasshopper and other tools are really robust and can do a lot of things, and we have people who understand them really well, but there have been times when the kind of digital proficiencies and the kind of coding and development proficiencies have been useful for other parts of practice. Also geospatial thinking, so people that are really comfortable working at large scales, that's been something which has been useful as applied to the design practice, maybe less so in fabrication. But yeah, I mean, hiring for SITU research, the kind of profile of who works for us is still a bit of a mystery to me. We were just recently hiring a coder developer, and we're competing with Google and Microsoft, and so this kind of idea that there are people who are interested both in kind of computation and activism and human rights, and are willing to forego the salaries that they'd get paid at some of these other companies to work for us, made the pool smaller, but these people really exist, and they're out there, and they tend to be pretty interesting folks. It also works the other way around, where an example is Akshay Mehra is a guy that came to us from Cornell undergrad in architecture. After his first internship, he wanted to come work at SITU, and he ended up being a kind of self-taught savant coder who left architecture entirely and started a PhD in geoscience at Princeton. So I think the experience of coming from architecture, working at SITU, and at least in his case, being exposed to other things opened up new kind of career pathways and brought him into a new world. And I'm really interested to see it kind of fold back in after he comes back from that program, and how he might re-engage the world of design. So I think what is a kind of unexpected relationship to architecture is the way I'd answer that question. I mean, of course, we bring tools that are somewhat specific to architecture and a visual sensibility, but I don't think that's the most important thing. I think what it is a kind of, is a type of thinking and experience which has to do with synthetic practice. It's the ability to, if you're building a building, you're stewarding trades, and you're not doing all the MEP and the structural and all that stuff yourself. You're identifying who should be working on what, and helping coordinate and make sure that there's fidelity to the design intent. And I think it's absolutely the kind of thinking that's at work here, that perhaps is distinct from visualization, other visualization fields, or people coming from other backgrounds. And in this sense, it's more to do with the disparate types of data sets that you encounter when working on human rights cases. So every case is quite different. You might have testimony, you might have geospatial information, you might have ballistic evidence, you might have a problem that you don't actually know how to solve yet, but you need to be able to think critically about tools. And that is where the kind of synthetic approach is super important. The ability to steward, and figure out how to create a coherent spatial narrative out of any and all possible, information. I'd say also and I don't know if this is specific to architects, but there's a desire, at least on our part, to quantitative work and call it qualitative work tend to be kept separate. Sometimes for good reason, a lot of the time not. And I think the attitude that one can leverage any and all data that might be useful for understanding a specific case is somehow aligned with design thinking. So that's been super interesting. That is it's a body of work that we've done with a geologist at Princeton, who's actually an old friend. And what the genesis of this work is really conversations about mapping, about space, even kind of structural questions. He works on sort of tectonic structural questions, and we work in PSI, but these are it's the same language, but he's working on different scales of time. And what it's led to is basically, collaborations on projects that, for whatever reason, couldn't be solved within the geosciences alone. They tend, I mean, it's probably too much to get into here, but projects where digital modeling and even digital fabrication have been extremely useful in his research, basically. And so it's been really interesting. We've worked together. We've got a grant from the National Science Foundation, and we've developed a piece of instrumentation which we've patented, which, developing products and patenting things is not something I think we anticipated ourselves doing. And talking to folks interested in carbon sequestration and the energy sector about how these tools might be used beyond Earth history and Earth science. So it's both super useful for him in terms of the research he's doing, but it's also a kind of prospective source of revenue for us as a practice, which is also interesting. At this point, yeah. At this point, they are. That wasn't always the case. I mean, fabrication in the beginning was the kind of, so we graduated from Cooper Union, the partners, and we immediately started our practice right away. Nobody had worked for any other firm, so the business model, the way we were able to do that was to have fabrication practice, which designed and built for other artists and architects, and while we were doing that, we were growing our design practice, and I'd say research was behind that. So at the beginning, fabrication, at the very beginning, fabrication was the way we were kind of growing design and to some extent research. But at this point, with research being funded by grants, with Studio getting real, proper design work now, with fabrication continuing to do, a lot of work, each is sustainable and kind of as a business model, yeah. And interestingly, the question of whether or not research should stay part of be an LLC or a 501c3 is something that's on the horizon as well. No, why do you hate to talk about branding? I mean, it's super important. It's super important. I mean, we were SITU Studio originally, and the kind of branding was a really important question because, the idea was like, how do we talk about all of it, and how do we talk about some of it? And how do we, each had to have its own color, and also it reflects the overall ambitions of the practice. I think, first and foremost, there is a hierarchy. This is not like our overall vision for the practice is, it's not, 3 equal divisions, all making the same money and everything. We want to do important buildings, and we want to change thinking about architecture. And so the studio, SITU Studio, which is our design practice, is in some sense, there's siblings, but perhaps there's twins and then an older sibling or something. I don't know what the right metaphor is, but that's a reflection about, that's a reflection on how we present the practice and talk about it, and even the kind of branding and thinking about how we represent it externally. Yeah, look, I mean, we want to do culturally important architecture, whatever that means. There are practices, like OMA and DSR that I think, are really interesting precedents and models who, especially in DSR's case, had a whole trajectory in life that was kind of like, around architecture until they started actually making buildings, right? And then once they did, the buildings, the commissions they were getting were really important. And I think that it's a precedent which means something to us. And the kind of work that they're doing now is the type of work we hope to be doing at some point. Yeah, I think this kind of other history of the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies was really interesting. It's not something I was familiar with. It's not something I would have guessed that would have come out of that place. It's good. It gives texture to a history which I'm guilty of kind of caricaturing in some sense. For me, it represents discourse of autonomy and I mean, oppositions was a very diverse, there were a lot of voices, right? But civic engagement and projects in Brownsville it's just not what I would have associated, and maybe I'm just naive about it. But I'm glad that that's what you guys focused on, as opposed to a history which I think is more familiar with those who have studied the center. So that's what kind of stood out. We've also been kind of operating outside of the academy for the last 10 years, deliberately. And I think maybe we would know more about some of these precedents if we were more embedded. But for us, the last 10 years have been about kind of doing applied work. And for me, I was an art history major actually originally, way back, and I've put that on the shelf. I may come back to it at some point. I mean, in terms of the research work, these are problems which aren't problems. I mean, it's just like Adam Malouf at Princeton banging his head against the wall because the samples are sitting on a shelf because there's an arcane process for processing them. There wasn't that he needed to figure out a way to automate the digitization and the fabrication. So it wasn't identified as a kind of brief, right? It was very kind of it was just a challenge that he was facing. And I think it's a similar thing in the human rights field. The human rights organizations are going to write reports. They always have and they always will, but they've been textual, they've been long form, they tend to use photographs and maps at times, but the idea that there could be a different way of leveraging different specific tools and kind of creating a different spatial narrative emerges through conversations between designer and lawyer, between designer and geologist, between designer and activist. So it's neither that we come to them with the kind of solution, nor that they've established the brief very clearly. It's the nature of interdisciplinary work that, and it's also really important to say that a lot of the time our work is not helpful to these people. If you're doing an epidemiological study at a certain scale, or you need a statistician, you don't need a designer. It's just that there are a lot of cases where it is useful. And that's where, so what I think is interesting is that I don't know where this story ends in terms of architecture. The ground is shifting. What's clear is that there's silos that tend to prevent people from talking to each other and having these conversations. And what's also clear is that there's gaps in knowledge. So the expanded role, right? My hope for that is that these conversations, these gaps are identified by both sides, and it's not, the design studio chasing other collaborators, and that good work can be done in the fields in between. And I think that the definitions of architecture and the definitions of geoscience and human rights, and maybe there's some new disciplines that we don't know about yet, begin to emerge. I don't think it's about interdisciplinary work going on forever, it's just that certain gaps being exploited. I'm really glad. Well, I'll just say that I'm really glad that you guys did this show. It seems, especially that, I mean, I don't think it should be taken for granted that this is the Canadian Centre for Architecture, and the exhibition was done on the kind of expanded role. And I'm going to talk about that tonight in the presentation. It's important for shows like this to force us to question the profession, education, what you can do with your degree when you graduate, right? Which is also pretty depressing sometimes, if you think about it narrowly. So no, I mean, I have to spend more time, I think, to come up with specific questions. But I'll just say that I'm really glad that you guys took this approach, and I hope it travels and other people get to see it.